recently, and I've seen a lot of really good stuff. And one thing I liked was this Karl Gruner, who really talked about stuff that I was really interested about, and I wanted to have a chat with him. And one was that he hinted there that he has the secret key to win all debates against leftists when they want to do some economic arguments, and you can just debate them and win with facts and logic, and facts don't care about your feelings, kind of things. And I want to start debating on the internet, and I think I have a good grasp. I could debate, and actually I'm doing it sort of next week. Talk about that why the nationalist movement needs Christianity, and kind of what is the secular benefits of Christianity, even if you don't believe or know if there is God. But that is one subject that I want to broaden my understanding of debate subjects, and I want to have kind of particular angles to go at it. Communism might be bad because a lot of leftists don't want to debate you, so it might be really hard to ever get to test these strategies we are going to go over today, but maybe you will have some better luck, and the best ideas, I hope, will win in the society. But first, let's hit with, we have a news about this Christian politician in Finland called Päivi Räsänen, and can we get the share screen from the news? So I'll go over it, and then Karl can introduce himself and then tell his opinion about this news. So I'll just read. Finnish politician under hate crime investigations for sharing Bible verse on Facebook. Police are investigating Christian politician in Finland for an alleged hate crime because she shared a Bible verse on Facebook to criticize National Church that participated in the LGBT Pride festivities. In the post, Congressman Päivi Räsänen, a Christian Democrat, criticized the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland for participating in the Helsinki LGBT Pride events in June. Her criticism was alongside a picture of Romans 1 verse 1, chapter 24 to 27 that describes same-sex relationships as shameful. Founder of conversion therapy organization, okay, that might be some kind of ad. Her post made Räsänen the subject of pre-trial investigation by the Finnish police for a suspected incitement against sexual and gender minorities. The pre-trial investigations have yet been completed. Police will provide more details once the investigations have been completed or presented to prosecutor for consideration of changes. The Helsinki Police Department officers in charge of the investigations told Helsinki Times. Räsänen, who is a member of and is married to a pastor in Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland, came under fire for her June Facebook post. How can the church doctrinal foundation, the Bible, be compatible with lifting up shame and sin as a subject of pride, hashtag LGBT, hashtag Helsinki Pride 2019? Yeah, you can scroll on down. I'm not going to read the tweet now for time. And the vast majority, 69% of Finns are member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, which has a steady decline over the last few years, according to Evangelical Focus. In mid-August, the Finnish politician tweeted, "I am not concerned on my part as I trust this will not move to the prosecutor. However, I am concerned if quoting a Bible is considered even slightly illegal. I hope this won't lead to self-censorship among Christians." And she links the same passage where she got to trouble in the first place. Räsänen's minority party holds 5 seats in the 200-seat Finnish parliament. She is known for her defense of traditional Christian views on abortion and marriage, but After being called homophobic, the politician tweeted, "It's not right to label Christian convictions as phobia." She's one of the 3 politicians in the nation under pre-trial investigation right now, joining Social Democrat Hussein Al-Tae and Finnish party Juha Mäenpää, who are suspected of incitement due to racist comments. And go ahead, Karl.
Well, okay. Did you want me to first introduce myself a little bit, or just go straight into the comments on this article?
First introductions, if you may.
Yes. All right. Okay, that's what I thought. So, yeah, my name is Karl Gruner. I live in the United States, in Florida, in Orlando, and I do have a little bit of a distant tie to Finland indirectly. That my father is actually from Estonia originally, so I know the language is very similar. And I've been to Tallinn a few times, which is not too far from Helsinki, across the Baltic there. But anyway, regarding the article, obviously, in the United States, we don't have quite the same problem as in Europe regarding freedom of speech. We have the First Amendment. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that concept, that we are still here free to express our views the way we want, even though sometimes views may be unpopular. There are, of course, limits, and if you actually incite people to violence immediately, that can be considered speech that can be censored or punished. The typical example is crying fire in a crowded theater so that you would cause a panic for no reason. That's not considered free speech, obviously. But just expressing an opinion about what you think is right and wrong is still very much protected here in the United States. Apparently, to my great dismay, in Europe in general, it varies from country to country to some extent, but I know, I also grew up in France, and I've lived in Germany over 20 years in my life. And I know I've also lived in the UK for 3 years, although it's been quite a while, not recently. That the trend has been for governments in Europe to limit speech, even in circumstances where really no harm is being done to anybody directly. So the harm, it's always a trade-off between the liberty to express yourself and the potential that you're going to offend other people. And at least the American way of looking at it is, if all you're looking at is the potential to offend people, then free speech should win. So, there is always a risk that whatever you say is going to offend somebody, but that's not a reason why you should be censored. And that's a very, very important principle. And unfortunately, in Europe, this is a perfect example of something that in the United States, there would be no question that there would be no prosecution or not even an attempt to prosecute this. This would be perfectly okay. Now, I know some people on the left in the United States would argue that it shouldn't be, and they are arguing that we should restrict free speech. But so far, they have been, and thankfully, they have been unsuccessful. So we still have that right to express our views, as long as it doesn't physically harm anybody, then it's okay.
But that is the really interesting thing, that I think they are starting to argue that they are actually physically harming them, at least here in Finland.
Yeah, but they would have to prove this. I mean, is somebody? I could see if the person in question were actually calling for people to, let's say, every time they see a homosexual or gay person in the street, to start attacking them physically. I could see how that would be bad, but that's not at all what they're saying. They're saying they just disagree with that lifestyle, and that's it. I don't think they're not arguing that government should pass a law that punishes, and until not too far back. I mean, the very famous case of Alan Turing in the UK. This was back in the 40s and 50s. In the 1950s, it was still illegal to do homosexual acts in the UK and in many other countries. So I don't think anybody's advocating a return to that kind of regime. If they were, I might have a different opinion. But all they're doing is expressing a view, which is a pretty common view for Christians. And part of Christianity is also the quality of forgiveness. So we understand. And again, I'm speaking as a cultural Christian, not a actively religious Christian. But we understand that sometimes we can disagree with people, but we can still tolerate them doing what they want as long as they don't harm us, right? So we don't agree with something, but we agree that they should still be allowed to do it. It's two different things. You can disapprove of somebody's conduct, but you can still say, but I don't think they should be punished for it. They should be able to do it.
Yeah,
even though I don't like it. That's part of being that living in a society. We have to be somewhat tolerant of other people's differences, but being tolerant is not the same thing as being accepting 100% of everything. There is a big difference between acceptance and tolerance, and the left has now crossed the line between saying yes, tolerance is good. Now they have to say no, it's not good enough. You not only have to tolerate, you have to fully accept and embrace anybody's behavior at all, no matter what it is. And that's a very different story. And I think that's going way too far.
Yeah, I agree. And that is what we are seeing happening. It's really strange. And what I'm alarmed about is that not really many Christians speak out against this. I mean, it can become that then you have actually a part of the Bible that is labeled hate speech.
Oh, well, people are afraid. That's what I think, European governments want it to be that way. They want people to be afraid. That's why they are, threatening, in Canada, of course, the very famous case, that's what propelled, I'm sure you're familiar with Jordan Peterson and,
yeah,
and
sure.
how he came to be very famous, and, professor of psychology in Toronto in Canada, became famous because of his opposition to Bill C-13 in Canada, which basically prohibited the use of, or mandated, not prohibited, mandated the use of proper gender pronouns, and that was passable of punishment. And they say, well, nobody's going to be sent to prison for it. All we're going to do is fine you. We all have to pay a fine for using the wrong gender pronoun when addressing somebody, when there are, potentially dozens of these gender pronouns, and you don't know who, when, what. It can change. It can change from 1 minute to the next. Jordan Peterson said, no, I will not comply with this. And that's exactly what the government of Canada was trying to do, is make people afraid of using the wrong words. And so more and more people in Europe and Canada are afraid to say things. Again, there are things, it's not the same thing as advocating complete free speech. I said you should be able to say anything, including yelling fire in a crowded theater. Everybody understands there are limits. So the question is, where are those limits to free speech? But certainly, free speech is so important to the proper ordering of a society that the limit should be, the default limit should be on the side of letting people express themselves, as long as they are not physically harming or physically inciting the harm to other people. They're not actually calling for violence, and they are just expressing their views. that should absolutely be allowed. And I think this case is pretty egregious. Again, it's part of a strategy for governments to make it to to actually make people so scared of expressing themselves that they just can't anymore. They have too much to lose. If you are the average citizen, they don't want to go to prison for saying the wrong thing, because sometimes you don't even know if what you're saying is wrong or right. The lines are not clearly drawn, so it's very subjective in a way, and so you're never sure on which side of the line you fall on.
Yeah, and let me set up you the best punchline in the story, because maybe she was stressed or something. This must be very stressful for her to be under investigation. But she tweeted out that I have this pamphlet, this kind of a PDF I have written 14 years ago. Police actually investigated it and it seemed fine. So here you have some hate speech free information or whatever. And then police started a new investigation. And the strange thing is this, and this is the very Orwell part about it, is that in 2011 we changed the hate speech code in Finland. So this happened, this crime, before before this law was even in order. So how can anyone know when they are a thought criminal?
Yeah, right. And one of the basic law, principles in society that you should not retroactively condemn people for things they did before the law was passed, right? So you can't. That's one of the basic principles, that until the law is passed, after the law is passed, of course, you could say, well, people know the law, and now they can be, responsible for their actions in breaking the law. But you can't break the law before the law is passed, right? Retroactively. If it wasn't a law at the time, then how can you break it? So yeah, it just goes to show the the double standard. What's amazing is that I don't know about in Finland, but in the United States, what is truly amazing is that some right-wing or conservative politicians and commentators, TV hosts, are condemned for saying some things that are judged to be, homophobic or racist or whatever it is, and there are calls for shutting them down and shutting down their voices, when at the same time, some elements on the far left are actually causing violence in the street. I mean, actual violence, beating people on the head with baseball bats and chains, and and the motorcycle chain, and all kinds of things. Like Antifa is definitely one of those organizations, and nothing happens to them. So the potential threat of violence is condemned, even though it's not there, but the actual violence in the street is basically not punished at all. So the double standard is what's completely extraordinary. That it's not okay to express an opinion that something's wrong, but if you go out in the street and start hurting people with actual violence, everybody looks the other way. I mean, not in all cases. There have been some arrests, in the most extreme cases. So it depends. But I know in Berkeley, California, when there were some riots that happened at the university there. And that's where I went to school. I went to the University of California at Berkeley a long time ago. It was rather peaceful when I went to that university, but times have changed. And there was that was about 2 years ago, I guess, or something like this, when Milo Yiannopoulos went to speak there. There was violence And the police just stood there and did nothing. There were fires started, there were people being beat up, and nothing happened. That somehow that wasn't something that was thought to be punishable. But on the other hand, the same people on the left will come out in an outcry if at the mere verbal expression of some disagreement with some leftist policy, which is just amazing. The double standard is incredible. But like I said, again, so far in the United States, because of the First Amendment, most of these attempts to try to put some severe restriction on speech and freedom of expression have come to nothing. Of course, right now the Supreme Court of the United States, has a slight majority of conservative judges. So far, I would say the chances of the Supreme Court deciding against that, changing that rule, the interpretation of the First Amendment is not likely, but you never know, though. It's it's not, nothing is ever impossible. So let's just say the trend is not good. The trend is not good. And in Europe, most countries in Europe have crossed way over the line now. That's why it's very, very disturbing to me to see what's happening in Europe today. So, there are voices like Douglas Murray who are expressing the same kind of concern. And he's not the only one. I mean, there are many other voices. But unfortunately, the trend has definitely been towards more and more restrictions on free speech in Europe. I know in France for sure, in Germany, I guess in Finland. I was not that familiar with the case in Finland, but from what you're saying, it's just as bad there. So it's a very disturbing trend.
Yes.
Anyway,
So I think we can then maybe move on to next subject. That is going to be the economical argument against communism, because I'm really wanting to do some debates, and if someone wants to challenge me, then maybe we can do it even in the modern debate channel, if it does something to do with Christianity or something like that. And I have been thinking I want to debate someone on like kind of secular benefits of Christianity, how it lowers the crime rate, how it
absolutely. I'd be on your side. I would be on your side. I would be on your side on this. Absolutely. Again, I'm not a religious Christian. I don't go to church. I have in the past, but it's not one of my big things. But I'm definitely consider myself a cultural Christian, in the sense that I do understand that my cultural values might not be, let's say, 100% coming from Christianity, but a huge portion of them are Christian values. And most of us don't even understand that, because people don't study history anymore. So they have no understanding of, everybody thinks that the Enlightenment was what created was the main source of our present values in the Western societies. But what they don't understand is the Enlightenment era itself, that movement would not have been possible without Christian values in the first place.
It's funny thing, I am against Enlightenment values. I think Enlightenment was kind of a scam, that we were sold these ideas about humanity that are very harmful.
I understand that. I agree with that. I think it's not that simple one way or the other. I think some of the Enlightenment values actually did use and continued some of the Christian values that preceded it. So they were in a continuation of that, and they re-emphasized some of these values. But then you're absolutely right that they invented some new values that led us astray. And I would agree with you that we have to be very, very careful to parse out things that came out of the Enlightenment that might have been good, but then there are some other things that were not very good at all. So,
And
yeah,
I
so
think,
yeah, I agree with you to a large extent.
and in some way, I think enlightenment seems to be for a lot of people this kind of whole package. You can look at some kind of Steve Pinker who he thinks he's kind of coming from a neutral place, but
Yeah, he's not.
it's not really. And it's very hard to describe what's wrong there, but it's very this kind of a fetishization of enlightenment values.
Yeah, that's right. It is a fetishization. I would agree with that. That's why I say that some of the values, the Enlightenment in part was a reaction to the the religious tensions, the wars of religions that had happened throughout history, and more recently, not too long before the Enlightenment, specifically the conflicts between the Catholic Church and the Reformation movements, right? Lutherans, Calvinists, all the Reformation. There were some serious problems. I mean, people were killing each other over this, right? That's not to mention, earlier conflicts between Christianity and Islam, for example, which to some extent still continue today in various forms. I don't think anybody would deny that. So the Enlightenment, in some ways, did contribute to sort of reconciling all sides to a sort of cohabitation where everybody was able to tolerate. Again, toleration being not acceptance of the other people's views, but just acceptance of the fact that, okay, we have different opinions as to, how to interpret the Bible, or whether the Bible is the only word, or whether we need interpret.
Looks like I was flown out of here. I hope other people can reconnect. I think there was problem in the internet. There was problem. Okay, so and please leave comments if you like. You can ask anything. We try to answer everything. You don't even have to super chat us, because we don't even have that possibility. But this channel is about to get so epic, so like, share, and subscribe while we wait for the others to come back. Yeah, that was really, really interesting.
I'm sorry,
really
I'm back.
interesting.
I had a computer problem.
I don't know. I think if you had it, I had it also, because I was flown out. Everything stopped.
Yes,
And now we're
well,
back.
it might be a software problem with your the chat software. Anyway, yeah. So anyway, but I'm back. So all
Yeah.
right.
So maybe I wanna talk about a little bit how I see the Enlightenment. That there's kind of this push for universalism in ethics, and that's really kind of strange. And
If you mean, one of the things I just I've been fighting, or on the internet and everything, is this push towards moral relativism. Everybody has basically is the judge of their own values, and there is no objective standards. There are no absolutes. Everybody does their own thing. That's a very, very nefarious and dangerous way to think. If there are no absolute standards, then eventually what's going to happen is it's going to end up in violence. If we can't use reason and argument to sort out our differences, and the reason and argument are based on some absolute values. So it's not; these aren't relative things. So that's my point of view. At the very minimum, we need to agree that there are some things that just we can't deny without a grave danger to our civilization and our culture.
One thing I'm really interested is objective morality. Do you believe there is kind of an objective morality?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. Yeah. Now, there's two ways of looking at it. Of course, people that are religious will say there is an objective morality, but it's only possible if you believe in God, right? Because the objective morality is the morality that is given to you by God. I don't believe that. I think you can have objective morality with or without God. It doesn't matter. As a matter of fact, I think it's better to derive it from non-supernatural, from natural, objective facts of the world, because it's a fact that people believe in different gods. The God of Christianity is not the same. Now, some people argue it is the same God as Islam. The fact is, Sharia law and what it says in the Quran is not the same as what it says in the Bible. And Muslims, I don't want to get into an argument whether they're right or wrong. I'm just saying they think different things than Christians do. And so then you have to get into argument is their morality the objective morality, or is Christian morality the objective morality? What I think it's better is to say that objective morality is simply derived from the facts of our existence on Earth, with the circumstances that we live on, and these are objective circumstances. The fact, for example, that there are many people with different goals in life that have to be reconciled one way or the other, hopefully without us killing each other. The fact that there is a scarcity of resources. We never have all the things that we want. There's always more things that we would like to have compared to the resources that are available to us to create them. So automatically that brings up a competition for resources. These are facts of reality, and if you accept those, from those, you can derive quite a bit of the moral values that we happen to have, actually. For example, the fact that private property is a moral good can easily be derived from the facts that I just mentioned, which are the fact that people have different ends. They want to do different things with the resources of the world. And so the best way to keep them from fighting each other over access to these resources is to create a regime of private property where with your own property, you are able to do whatever you wish with nobody else interfering in it. But then again, your responsibility is also to leave other people's private property alone, unless you get permission from them to do something with it. It's very, very important. And it basically proves the moral value of private property. I don't have time to go into the whole argument here, but I think you can see the outline of the argument, at least from what I just said. These are completely objective. These are not subjective factors that I just mentioned. It is a fact that there are billions of people on the earth. It is a fact that there are limited resources. It is also a fact that these billions of people don't all want the same thing. They have different ends and goals that they want to reach. And that sometimes these ends and goals come in conflict with each other. And that the best way to resolve this is to have this regime of private property where you can do what you want with what you've created and earned or exchanged with people freely. And then you just don't touch other people's property. Of course, that doesn't exclude the fact that we could also have, some forms of public property. It's called the commons, public roads and things like this. That's a different story. But in general, if you're that, and that's one of the big arguments against communism. That's not the argument you're talking about. It's not the economic calculation argument, but it's one of the arguments about owning everything in common. Is that if everybody owns everything in common, it is inevitable that people will have conflict over how to use their resources. Now, of course, one of the ways you can resolve this is to have a dictator that just says, okay, I'm the only person in the world that can decide how we're going to proceed, and everybody else has to follow my orders. That is one way to solve the problem. You just get rid of the divergence of opinion, and you said the only opinion that counts is the opinion of the dictator. Everybody else has to obey. So that's one way to solve the problem. I don't think most people would say that's the best way. And so the way that most civilized societies and cultures have adopted is a regime of private property.
When you say multiple goals, I start to think of kind of multicultural society, and I'm thinking about when you have the hate speech law, that is it just a natural state that if you don't have the hate speech law, then these different cultures will just rip each other apart or offend their feelings or something?
Yeah, obviously I'm very much opposed to multicultural society. I mean, we have to understand what I'm saying here. Obviously, I'm pretty multicultural myself in a way. I mean, I immigrated to the United States from France. So my father was American, but he himself was an immigrant from Estonia, and so we obviously carry, each one of us, some elements of, for me, a little bit of the Estonian culture, quite a bit of the French culture, quite a bit of German culture, because I lived in Germany over 20 years. And of course, I'm an American first and foremost. So I understand, the fact that people can have multiple traditions. However, that only goes so far. At some point, we do have to share a lot of common values, cultural values, to be able to coexist peacefully with each other. For example, the belief in free speech is one of them. And the belief in tolerating other people's opinion is very, very important. The fact yesterday I had a discussion on a YouTube channel, and one of the things that we came out with also was that what's very important is trust, being able to trust the people around you. So the culture of trust. And in the Western societies, we used to have that. We used to be able to leave the door open of our house and pretty much be certain nobody was going to come in and steal things from us. And that's changed a lot. I saw in Germany, when I lived there, I saw the change. In the early 80s, you still had that culture of trust that you knew, again, you could leave the door unlocked. You could leave your bicycle out in the street, and nothing was going to happen to it. Nobody was going to steal it. Nobody was going to hurt you. And now it's completely changed. You can't do that anymore. You cannot leave your door unlocked. You cannot leave your bicycle out in the street, because for sure, within an hour, it'll be gone. You have to lock it. You have to take precautions everywhere. And a big part of this is because our culture has been changed by this, sort of acceptance of multiculturalism, and it's been hurt a lot by it. I think it was a lot better before, when I was able to just trust people and know that they shared the same values of, do not cheat, do not steal, do not lie. These were things that were commonly understood to be shared values. Of course, there were always exceptions. There was always, the occasional criminal. Of course, there's always bad people in every society, and but at least we knew to condemn them, and the law was going to punish them severely if they did something like this. Now we've basically, after the 60s and 70s, on this movement to basically say that criminals were not responsible for their action, it was society's fault. So we should not condemn them for what they did. Nobody is responsible for their action. To the point that a large portion of the political left even went as far as denying the idea of free will. In other words, that none of us is responsible for our actions. We are all the result of just our circumstances. That therefore, when we do bad things, that's just the way it is. There's nothing we can do about it. And we should not put people in prison. Or some people say, well, yeah, we can still put people in prison, but we can't judge them morally. We just do it as let's say, and that's the case that, Sam Harris argues that, let's say if a bear comes into your neighborhood and attacks a person, of course, the bear is not morally responsible, but we're still going to lock the bear up in the zoo or in a cage so that he's not harming people in the future. And he says we should treat people exactly the same. We can still put them in prison, but not because we condemn them morally, only because we want to prevent them from doing further harm in the future. And this is a completely insane view. That it makes no sense. And this kind of view has done enormous harm to our culture, to our society, and to the ability to coexist peacefully with each other. It's a very tragic thing, and if it continues, unfortunately, I don't forecast a very bright future. I think in Europe it's far worse than in the United States right now, although it is a problem here as well. But sharing a common cultural background as far as those basic values of respect for the individual, being able to trust others, not to lie, cheat, or steal, and the culture of toleration. So in other words, I might not agree with you, but I'll let you do, as long as you don't harm me or others, I will accept that you believe something else than I do. These are values that are very essential, and unfortunately, not people are very naive, thinking that everybody in the world shares those values, but that's not true. I have lived and worked in many different countries around the world, and I can tell you that this is not a universal way to. These are not universally shared values around the world. There are many cultures where there is no culture of trust. It's always, well, as soon as the other guy looks the other way, I'm going to take advantage of him, one way or the other. And so there is a culture of, cronyism, nepotism, always taking care of your own first. There's, you can see the differences, let's take a look at China. And, in some ways, after the reforms, post-Maoist, China has come closer to the values of the West, but they've come closer mostly in the economic realm. But their culture is still very different than ours. And you can see this. They can see how they try to take advantage of us economically. And to them, it's not they don't understand why it's a problem. That they keep cheating. They steal our ideas. They violate copyright laws and patent laws, and they engage in industrial espionage. And to them, it's what's the big deal? That's the way of the world. That's the way we think everybody operates. So, that does lead to some fundamental misunderstandings. And that's something that, okay, we understand why that is at the scale of the planet, why different countries and different cultures. And I guess it's Samuel Huntington, one of the writers that I think one of his books is called The Clash of Civilizations. And it's largely about that. It's largely about this clash of different cultural values across the world, and who is going to win. And if anybody, maybe nobody's going to win. Maybe we'll just keep having this clash forever. But the fact is that different cultures have different values, and I think the Western way, the Western culture, while not perfect, so far had the best values that we have ever experienced historically in the world, in the history of the world. And again, it doesn't mean that they're perfect. It just means that overall, we probably had the best deal going of anybody. And to some extent, you can see that reflected in the fact that the rest of the world is trying to adopt some of these values, but at the same time, they're trying to adopt some of our best values. We in the West are actually abandoning and dumping some of the things that made us a good society. And that's what scares me a little bit.
Yeah, there's two things I want to touch up there kind of quickly, and then we'll go to the economic argument. First of all, was that I was reading about this book, Bowling Alone, and it talks about how in multicultural societies, public engagement goes down. People just have less societies they belong in, or groups they belong in. They have less interaction with their neighbors. They have less interaction with the common fellow in the street. Everyone is just looking like around and being kind of scared, or just some kind of apathy that you have just a headphones on and you are on your kind of own world until you go to your crappy apartment in a slum. And that's why I'm kind of drawn to the ideas of propertarianism, because it kind of defines this kind of a lot of conflict now in our culture. It's not being dealt in the legal level. And that's a problem. So, for example, you can promote open borders so you get money for yourself, and you'll never, like the cost of people's safety and their society and everything is just treated like it's nothing, and it can't be nothing.
Yeah, so but that's one of the basic fundamental principles of any society should have, is that you should never let decisions be made by people who have what's called in English, it's called having skin in the game. In other words, if you have nothing to lose by making a decision, you should not be entrusted with that decision. Never. When you make an important decision, that's why we have all these politicians making all kinds of decisions for the future of their countries. That no matter what, they're going to come out ahead. They're going to be rich. They're going to have their fat pensions for the rest of their lives. And it doesn't matter if their country goes down the drain. To them, it makes no difference. And I would say, by the way, it's not a coincidence that some of these very, very bad decisions have been made by, in Europe, most politicians, heads of states, at least, are people that have no children. They have no children, and therefore they don't really care about the future of their countries. I mean, they'll say they care, of course, they'll say that. But I can tell you that I have children, And I worry about their future. I really worry about their future. If somebody that's a politician and is making huge amounts of money being a politician and doesn't have children, do you think they're really deep down going to care what happens to their country after they're gone, like 20 or 30 years from now? I don't think so. Of course, they have to say they do, because the voters won't like it. But you can tell from like the huge budget deficits that everybody's running. They're basically sacrificing their children's future because there's deficits at some point are going to have to be repaid. The huge government national debts that the U.S. and Europe is running. At some point, they have to be repaid. Now, right now, who's going to repay it is people that are not even born yet in some cases, or they're just children right now and had they were not the one who voted themselves a bunch of free stuff that they couldn't pay for, and they had to borrow money to get. But the children are going to, children that will be adult 20 or 30 years from now are the ones that are going to pay the price. But nobody seems to care.
And I think we are definitely gonna feel the effects of that. I'm thinking that it's a problem in democracy, because in democracy you need to buy the votes by giving more money to victim groups, and because the terms are 4 years, there's no incitement to think ahead. So, for example, we have this kind of a big governmental change in how our hospitals and stuff like this work. And they've been studying how they do it for many terms, because they use like 100 million to study how to do it. And then the next guys who choose what to do, they don't want those kind of balances there. Then they'll do it all the study again from a different ideological angle. And nothing gets done, but the money gets spent, and a lot of it is sent to Africa. A lot of it goes to asylum business. And this is one thing that is true, what you said here in Finland right now. Our top leader politicians, they are, or their families, involved in the asylum business. They get money from that. So that's a huge problem. But it's not illegal.
Yeah, that's right. There's a huge problem with the government, the politicians being able to make money for themselves one way or the other. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. The only thing they care about. You're right. It's very short-sighted. That is a problem with democracy. Unfortunately, we may have to say that democracy is the least worst system, perhaps, but my point is democracy is not enough. You have to also have severe restrictions as to what the government cannot do with the taxpayers' money. So for me, like in the United States, this has been brought up many times, but what's called the balanced budget amendment would be like passing an amendment to the Constitution that forces the politician to not spend more money than when they take in. So in other words, if your revenues, typically in the U.S., the GDP, the gross domestic product, is about $20 trillion a year. The government spends, I think, $3.5 to $4 billion of that. But right now we have huge budget deficits because they spend, let's say, don't quote me on the exact figure, but let's say $4 billion in a year, but they only take in $3 billion in taxes. And so there's a $1 trillion, did I say billion? $1 trillion. There's a $1 trillion deficit every year. That started under Obama and now it's continuing under President Trump, unfortunately. So having a law that says, okay, you cannot spend more unless perhaps national emergency like a war, World War III starts. Then of course you do whatever you have. But normal peacetime economy, There should be a limit that says you cannot spend more than what you take in. Now in Europe, they tried this. They tried to limit the spending, and what it was a 3% limit on annual budget deficits. And I can't remember what the maximum debt was. Maybe 60%. I can't remember it anyway. But they were, 30 years ago, they tried to impose limits, and of course, everybody is going past those limits pretty much, with few exceptions. Like Norway is kind of a notable exception, but Norway has huge revenues from oil, so they cannot be used as an example for anybody else because they're very exceptional in that sense. They pretty much can afford whatever they want because of the oil revenue. But for most countries, like Greece, of course, is the example of the country that completely abused this and went way past their limits to the point that they became bankrupt. And if it wasn't for the aid of Germany in particular and France and other European countries, Greece would be pretty much like Venezuela is today. People just rummaging the streets, looking in garbage dumps to find something to eat. I firmly believe this is where Greece would be today if it wasn't for the fact that they have gotten billions and billions and billions, hundreds of billions of euros in aid from other European countries. And I know quite a bit. My mother lives in Greece. She's remarried to a Greek man, not my dad, but my stepfather. And so I keep track of what's going on there pretty closely. And so the only reason Greece is not a complete disaster right now, although it's not a good situation, but it's people are not starving. But the only reason is because of these massive subsidies and loans and all kinds of other things. And yet they still can't get over it. They still cannot get out of the hole. So unfortunately, I see, gradually the rest of Europe, Italy, Spain, there's all kinds of problems which are going to get worse and worse. And I tell you, one of the reasons it's going to get worse and worse is because Europe is having no babies. So, the population of Greece and Italy is going to dwindle. And when you have systems that are based on a lot of young people paying for the retirement and healthcare of a few older people, and now you have this inverted pyramid where there's going to be a lot more people that are retired and old compared to young people that are actually working. The math just does not work. It's impossible. So of course, people like Angela Merkel said, well, the solution to this is we're going to import along a lot of young workers from other countries, and they'll pay taxes, and that way we'll be able to afford paying all these pensions and healthcare that we promised everybody. And what's happening is most of the new immigrants, a lot of them do work, but first of all, they don't necessarily work in high-paying professions, so they don't pay any taxes, really. And a lot of them are actually on welfare, at least for a long time. So they're actually a net drain on the economy as opposed to a net plus. So that's not working either. So people tend to think of until the next election. The politicians certainly think only that far, until the next 4 or 5 years, maybe, if even that much. But if you look at the future of Europe, 30, 50, or 100 years from now, I don't see how you can be optimistic. It's a disaster. And there have been many books written about this. So,
I have read the Death of Europe just recently.
Right. The Strange Death of Europe, Douglas Murray.
One thing I would like to touch on that really quickly, and then I promise we'll go to the economic argument.
All right,
This is just too interesting, and we definitely need to have another discussion about, at least you have to give the argument you hinted at before. But Death of Europe, there was this chapter that kind of goes through the immigration policies of United Kingdom from like 60s to today. And there was, of course, this famous case, the Rivers of Blood speech. And the person who spoke it could have been the prime minister, like was most favored to be the prime minister, but was then declined for that or something because of what he said. And it was like something like the relevant clause was something like that every second house in London is or some area in English is immigrant. And
Yes.
like 10 years after the infamous prediction, you have it. You in London, you have 50% immigrants and 50% Londoners. So it wasn't that far off, yet he was shunned from his political career and life, and it was all over for him. But when they go through this whole history from the 60s to today, what I got from that chapter is really, really dark, and it's that both the Conservative and Labour Party have promised less immigration if they get the keys to the government, and the best any of them have been able to do is for a short time increase the immigration, because they have proposed some kind of limitation which have activated many people to try to get their families to the country, but then in the end they have said they haven't implemented it, so it was all for nothing. And I'm thinking that in government, in politics, this is a sad look, but we can change like how much our economic taxes, but we can't change how many genders we have in our society, and we can't change immigration. Is this true or not?
Yeah, of course we should be able to, but now, of course, here in the United States, I can speak to that directly. Now, being anti-immigrant is being labeled as being racist, right? And actually, in the United States, nobody is anti-immigrant. I mean, basically, almost nobody. It depends on what do you mean. What kind of immigrants? Do you have quality immigrants? I mean, we're all in favor of getting more engineers and doctors and professors or whatever, or even skilled laborers. They're like plumbers, electricians. These are things where you can get a job. Of course, a lot of immigrants here in the United States are on short-term visas, and they are in the information technology sectors. A lot of people from India, and these are only temporary immigrants. At least in theory, they're only temporary. But these are the kind of immigrants you probably want, and particularly when they do adopt the values of the United States, that they do respect each other, and they don't lie, cheat, and steal. It's like the basics. And most of them do. That is not the problem immigration. The problem immigration is people that come here with nothing, have no skills, get immediately on welfare, have many children that probably will be raised without true exposure to American values, or in fact, many of them raise them in opposition to American values, because now the trend is to say that, well, America is bad and has done so many bad things in its history that we must deny any goodness at all in American values. So there is this trend that says, we're the ones that created all the victims throughout the world, which is completely false, of course. But so we do have to be careful when we talk about being, against immigration. There's some kind of immigration that might be okay and good, but we need to be much more selective about. It's not a human right to be able to immigrate to the United States. If it were, I guarantee you the population of the U.S. would go. Right now, it's about 330 million people, plus probably about I don't know, the estimates go from 10 to 20, maybe even more, illegal immigrants that are undocumented. But anyways, 330 million or so official population. I guarantee you, if you just let people say, hey, well, open borders, anybody can come in, you'd have 1 billion people in the United States before you know it. And you think you can absorb 1 billion people over a couple of years? That's crazy. It's insane.
Hey, think about it. I know how to fix this. So, what would make you promise open borders? What would you need to get out of it yourself if you are going to say open borders? And what I think is the answer is power. You need to have a lot of power for your open borders. And what happens with immigration is that immigrants tend to vote bigger government, more welfare, or more open borders. So they actually gets more power from having this open borders thing.
Oh, sure.
Before it all falls down, they will die, and you just brought that nihilism, existentialism theme, so they don't probably care what happens after they've died. So it kind of explains a lot.
Well, one of the key arguments against open borders, from the libertarian side or conservative side, would be that, in theory, you could say you could be an advocate for open borders, but that's only compatible with the abolition of the welfare state. In other words, it's okay if people come in and then work for a living. What's not okay is giving handouts to everybody that comes in automatically just because they're inside the country. Because obviously, economically, that's completely unfeasible. People just come in and the first thing they do is apply for welfare benefits, and basically get free education, free healthcare, free everything. On top of that, in the US, you have the situation where people come from Mexico across the border illegally, and they have a child, and the child is automatically a US citizen just because he or she was born in the US. So then you just can't kick them out again. So that's a huge problem, because a lot of people do that. And of course, then because the child cannot be kicked out of the US, and of course the parents cannot be kicked out because that would be inhuman. So we have a huge problem with this. But the fact is, in general, people will say, yes, you can have some immigration as long as you work for a living and you're not living off the taxes that everybody else pays. But even then, I think that, that there's some validity to that argument, but I think it only goes so far because you still have that cultural issue, that multicultural issue, right? I mean, even if somebody, let's say, coming from a Muslim country, works hard and doesn't live on welfare, if they also at the same time insist that they should live under Sharia law and not the laws of the United States, that's a big problem. I don't care if they work hard. I don't care if they are a doctor. I don't care if they are an engineer. I don't care if they are an IT professional. I don't care. If they come here, and I don't care if they make $1 million a year, if they come here and say, well, I don't think the laws of the US apply to me, I'm going to live under Sharia, then we can't have that. That's unacceptable. You cannot have immigration based on these kinds of principles.
I think we can still both agree that Sharia has one thing right, and it's the view on women, because there's a lot less divorces in Islamic cultures than our culture.
Yeah, but they do.
Just kidding.
Yeah, but that's a big discount. I know you're just kidding, because being able to have 4 wives in Islam, I know most men don't, but that's a huge issue in the Islamic world. I mean, there's a lot of issues with Islam, and that's not to say that most Muslims aren't good people. I have worked a lot in Islamic countries. And the most recent, until last year, I was working in Afghanistan, and I have a lot of good friends. Wonderful. Well, people are wonderful, but it's just that you can tell how coming from a different culture, biases them towards certain ways of seeing things, and not all these things are favorable. And so, um, it gives you a perspective that multiculturalism can only go so far. You can have a little bit of multiculturalism in a sense that, well, I like Mexican food, I like Chinese food, I like French food, Italian food. That's fine. That's the kind of multicultural. Or I can say I like Italian opera, or I like Italian cars. That kind of multiculturalism is fine. There's no issue with that. But when it comes to the very fundamental values that hold your society together, you cannot push it that far. You have to have some basic understanding of what our common cultural values are at the bottom. And you have to know that everybody understands the same thing. That's where the culture of trust comes from. You trust that your fellow citizens, your neighbors, actually share the same fundamental values. And I say those fundamental values are nothing extraordinary or very mysterious. So you can boil them down to very simple values. Like I say, I've mentioned it many times already in this conversation. I don't lie, I don't cheat, I don't steal. And I certainly don't take other people's lives, of course. I think most people understand that's kind of basics. But of course, there are from that you can derive a bunch of other values. And again, some people are very naive, particularly young people, and think the entire world thinks that way, but that is not the case at all. These are not universal values. I can tell you that for sure.
Strong Christian values didn't help Epstein.
Correct. These are based in Christianity. Christianity itself had to take quite a few centuries to basically sort it out, completely. I mean, for a long time within Christianity, still accepted slavery, for example. So, it took a while for it to be completely sorted out. And it's a very, very complex history of cultural values and how they evolve. But certainly Christianity is at the core of this evolution. I think it's undeniable. And I think people like Steven Pinker who deny this are completely mistaken. I think the author that gets it right, most recently, I can't remember the title of his book, but I think he's a British author called Tom Holland. And I haven't read his book. I think his book just came out. I wish I can remember. But if you look at Tom Holland, he just wrote a book about this very, very fact that our values in Western culture are rooted deeply in the basic values of Christianity. And most of us don't even realize that. We take it for granted. Even atheists in Western culture hold Christian values. They just don't understand that that's what it came from. So anyway, and Tom Holland is not a religious person himself, from what I understand. He wrote this basically from a very secular humanist point of view, but he came to understand. No, it's not. It's not. Yeah, so I'm saying not Tom Holland who plays Spider-Man. A completely different Tom Holland. They have nothing to do. They're not related. So, but that's a good point. I actually clarified this. It is not the Tom Holland that plays Spider-Man in
I was just about to talk about Tom Holland and the Spider-Man, but
no.
This, Dominion, how the Christian Revolution remade the world.
No, not that Tom Holland, but anyway.
But there's this Tom Holland book, Dominion.
Yes.
Is this what you're talking
Dominion,
about?
I think that's it. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's the book. I haven't read it yet. I think it just came out, or maybe it's coming out soon. I don't even know. It's imminent, or maybe it just happened. But I've seen some interviews of him on YouTube, and they were absolutely fascinating. Because I think what he says is very important. And I think it's something that most people in Western culture, in fact, they take Christian values so much for granted that they're willing to, because they don't understand where they came from, by rejecting Christianity from a religious point of view, they're tending to reject some of the Christian values that they grew up with. And so, um, anyway, that's a book that I definitely want to put on my reading list in the near future.
I also have a book recommendation on the same vein. I heard this actually from the Think Club channel. Why we need religion. I have it now here. I'm gonna go read it, but I think this had really interesting. This story of kind of this atheist professor in university, and then just like after class where he was really putting Christianity down, a young girl walks up to him and says that, well, there's this thing that I have my mother and my brother died a couple of years ago, and my mother went totally mentally broken and couldn't take care of me or themselves. And then he found Jesus Christ and could put her life together. And there's no way that she could do it without the religion. And there's nothing secular there to kind of study or find or that kind of effect that Jesus Christ and believe that he's resurrected and that the brother will be united in heaven. This idea can
Right.
really change your life.
Well, that's a difficult question. I think the need for religion is a very personal thing. I personally, I think, well, obviously we need the right cultural values. Whether religion is essential to maintain those cultural values or not is a very, very difficult question. I think there is two aspects to it. One of them is if if you don't think our fundamental values came from a God, let's say, why would people keep those values? All right, so that's one question. What is it that's holding us together? Now, I think personally that you can have an understanding of where our values came from a more secular point of view, but you have to be very, very careful how you do this, because otherwise it's very easy to fall, as secular humanism, as a culture, has fallen into this trap of value relativism and denying the fact that some values are absolute, and multiculturalism and all these kinds of things. So they have gone completely wrong on this. So again, you have to be very careful. But the other aspect is each person is different on how they manage to cope with the pain and suffering in the universe, the pain of suffering of other people, or the pain of suffering of your own self. Everybody has bad times in life. Sometimes some of us are blessed that the bad times aren't too bad, relatively speaking. We can put things in perspective and say, well, I'm having a really bad time now, but I'd still rather be me than somebody who is starving in the middle of the desert in Africa somewhere, that has it really bad. And I've been privileged to go to some very, very poor countries and to see it for myself. So whenever I feel sorry for myself, I start thinking about these people and say, well, no matter what, I still have it very, very good, no matter how things seem. But each individual will respond to adversity and pain and suffering in a different way. And I think if people think that they need a religion to cope with that, that's great. That's what they need. That's why, and we should not be like these celebrity atheists making fun of these people for believing in God and finding meaning and purpose in that. I think we should be more like Jordan Peterson and say, well, maybe there is something to it. And so even though myself, I don't feel religious, I understand religion. I understand the appeal. I understand its usefulness. So it's difficult for me because I can't be one of these people that say, well, I think everybody else should be religious except me. I'm the exception. So I can't say religion is for everybody. But I think there is a danger for sure in completely dismissing religion, and for sure the attitude that the celebrity atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, and in the past Christopher Hitchens, now passed away, that religion is the root of all evil in the world is completely mistaken. I mean, it's absurd. There is no evidence for this whatsoever.
I've studied their tricks, how they do it, and they have this very powerful method of, like, you can say, like, crusades are bad if you don't compare it to another group in somewhere else.
Yeah,
and you
right,
never do.
Right. Yeah, that's right, exactly.
No,
they have these absolute standards. By the way, they're judging religion by Christian standards. So, they're often, without even being aware of it, true. They are using values that they've been brought up with that are Christian values. But of course, they would deny that they're Christian values. To them, they're obvious. The sanctity of the individual and individual freedom and respect for people and all that. To them, it's a given. It's obvious. Well, it's not at all obvious until Christianity, came into the world. These were not values that were shared by anybody. No, not even the ancient Greeks with Plato and Aristotle, great philosophers. They didn't believe in any of that stuff. So.
I was brought up in single parent household, and me and my brother, I was read a lot of Bible when I was young, and I really knew the stories from it when I went to school, and it really helped in the religion class. I even got into trouble how well I knew one story and stuff like that. And when I went to, we have this kind of a confirmation camp when we are 15, and we go for a week to study these religious ideas. So I really kind of come into Christianity there, and I really believed in God and stuff like that. But then I went to army, and I had really, really hard time. I was just lowered everywhere there, and I even kind of broke my health, like definitely that my back is forever broken, and I have problems with that. So I think I'm the classical person who like, just God wouldn't let this happen to me, and I forsake the God. But then I was really into like these new atheists. Like I read Richard Dawkins' God Delusion. I was really, really big fan of Sam Harris and people like this, and I was really much into that. And I was the person who thought that Christianity is so evil and bad and only has negative effects and stuff like this. But when I heard about Jordan Peterson, I started to think about these things, and I've now read and looked at so many different angles more about this thing. And yeah, it's very interesting. Like I really am a cultural nationalist when you start to understand the effects of culture. But just one thing I want to press on there is that there are these fundamental absolute values and stuff like this, but then there is also this cultural playing ground that leftists think that they can change everything if they change the culture. Because I could think now that you could just make a generation of members in the society, and you just teach them from when they are babies that there is 73 genders, and they'll just go on believing that and implementing that on the laws and such, because they'll never have the debate in their head. Does it make sense?
Right. I mean, of course, indoctrination from young childhood is a typical method of government to try. But eventually, though, you're going to encounter reality. And that's the problem with this.
Yeah,
it might work for a while. You can pretend that reality is not there, and some people actually deny that reality is anything but what we make it to be. I mean, the postmodern movement was pretty much about that. That whatever we say reality is reality. Unfortunately, it doesn't matter if you think you're invincible. If you cross a highway with a bunch of speeding cars without looking left or right, you're probably going to die. It doesn't matter what you think. The car will hit you and kill you. It doesn't matter if you think that it won't or do. What you think makes no difference. The reality will happen. So at some point, that's what happened. And some people, yeah, they will go to their death thinking that what they thought was the right thing, and the ultimate decider of whether it was right or wrong is whether they survive or they don't survive. Of course, in modern society, the fact is a lot of people are able to survive with completely stupid ideas because our society is so rich. We're so prosperous. We're able to, some people who with idiotic ideas would have been dead a long time ago in a society where we had less abundance, are able to
I think we are having an audio problem that your voice is coming out and in, and it was very fine before, but maybe there's like
a voice.
Yeah, maybe there's like a voice activation and it goes away sometimes or something like that.
Okay, is it better now?
Yeah, it's better.
All right, okay. I think I have some problem with the jack on my headphones sometimes when it moves a little bit. I don't know how to look at it. But okay. In any event, where was I? That's my train of thought now. But what were we talking about specifically?
Well, I have a radical idea. We can definitely continue this. This is very interesting, and we share so much that I'm unfortunate to not be able to push back on that, because I think like if someone is watching this stream, they're like, "What? I need to defend atheism, and how can you let that pass? That was such a these are not mainstream ideas about this." But let's go to the economical argument, because I'm waiting for that. So I just give a little intro that I want to do debates, and I've seen a lot of arguments against communism, and I think one is the idea that when you have this kind of capitalist system, you have this invisible hand that kind of counts for you what are the prices in the stores for the objects. And I've understood that in communist system, you can have the shirt and the shoe and the item, because you can't have different brands competing. You just have, everyone has the same color of same type of clothes, for example. And it's very limited what kind of different products you can have in that system, because it can't calculate, and those brands can't compete each other, and you don't know how many you would stock. So you just give everyone the same soap, same shoe, same everything. But I want to hear, because I've never heard it in a YouTube video, that what would be kind of the more mathematical take on how to debunk communism. But there's one more thing that why I'm chosen, and I'm very interested in the math part, is that that's a natural science. Many people might say that, for example, evolution psychology is not a real science, or humanities are not a real science. I might say humanities are not a real science. But math is something that is hard to disagree with, unless you say that the math is just too white. That is now they're claiming that math is white, and they are changing it. They have different types of math. In United States, I'm not kidding. It's insane. But go ahead.
Well, to be careful with math itself, the argument I'm talking about is the very famous. Probably most people are not aware of it these days, apparently. But in the 1920s, this Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises came up with an argument against socialism, which in his time in the 1920s, socialism and communism were more or less equated, at least as far as the ownership of the means of production by the government, by the people at large, by the proletariat through the government. as opposed to the private ownership of the means of production, which would be the capitalist system. So that argument was that things to be produced don't possess intrinsic values in and of themselves. What do you know what the value of an apple is? What do you know what the value of a car is? What do you know what the value of a washing machine, of a house, of anything, a horse? I don't care. Just name it. How do you know what its value is? How do you evaluate that? And the only time that something can be assigned a value is at the time when you are willing to exchange it with somebody else against something else. So two people come, and let's say I have grown a bunch of apples, and you happen to be somebody who makes clothes, a tailor, and you need some food, so you want to buy some apples, and I need some pants. So I'll say, okay, I need a pair of pants, and you need some apples, and we both agree. And so now we're going to argue about how many apples I'm going to have to give you for you to give me a pair of pants, right? So in terms of apples, that determines the value of the pants, and it might be, let's say, 10 apples or 20. It doesn't matter what the number is. It's whatever the number. That's the point. The number is whatever the other person, the tailor who made the pants, agrees to take in exchange for the pants. There is no independent way to calculate the pants are worth 5 apples or 10 apples or 20 apples. They are worth exactly the number of apples that the tailor is going to be willing to take in exchange for the pants. So Mises' argument is this applies to everything that's being produced in an economy. And if you don't have, of course, in the modern economy, what I just described is what's called a barter economy. So you exchange a produced good, a finished good, for another. Well, in this case, the apples are not a finished good, but they're a consumer good. They're something that's been produced by agriculture, let's say, because I have an orchard. But in a more complex economy, of course, the value of things is expressed in terms of some kind of monetary unit, euros or dollars or whatever it was. In the past, it used to be gold or silver coins or other things that were considered to be money. So if you don't have a free market, the argument goes, you have no way to determine what the value of goods is. There's none. There's no way. You cannot do it because the value is acquired precisely at the moment of free exchange. So if there is no free exchange, nobody can calculate, and this is where the math comes in, so to speak, is it is impossible to calculate the relative values of goods against each other. Is a car worth more than, let's say, of course, we can more or less guess at a car because it takes so much labor and raw materials to produce is going to be worth more than, let's say, 2 apples, obviously. But is, let's say, a car worth more than a house, a small house, let's say? How do you know that? Until you're willing to exchange a house for a car, there's really no way to do this. So the argument is in a pure socialist economy where there is no free market whatsoever, it is impossible to know the value of things, and therefore it's impossible to calculate how many things you should produce of what kind, in what quantities, when you should produce them, and using what kind of raw materials, what kind of production processes. Because one of the things you have to understand is some of the initial reaction to this argument by some of the socialist economists was to say, well, yeah, we will agree, we'll admit that that's a problem for consumer goods. So therefore, we should probably have a market for things that are consumed, like cars or food or clothes, washing machines. But the means of productions should still remain in the hands of the government. And that doesn't work either, because that prevents you from calculating what the most efficient way is to build the things that you need. So these people that advocated this are called, market socialists. So it sounds like a contradiction in term, but what they were doing is they're saying, well, we won't have a market for capital goods. Let's say big machines that are able to press metal parts, or anything that like a factory or a power plant or anything like this that you need to produce goods. They're not consumer goods. But we can have a market for consumer goods, but that doesn't work either, because you still have to be able to evaluate what the value is of, let's say, a machine that stamps metal parts that you're going to use in the production of a car, compared to a machine that, let's say, cuts wood, like a seesaw or some kind of mechanical saw that's used in a lumber mill, or compared to any kind of tool, and not only that, you have to be able to compare the value of these tools compared to what the value of actual human labor is. How do you compute how much the value is of a college education, of becoming a doctor? Because that has an economic value. You're going to pay some money to go to college, right? I mean, I know in Europe college is free or whatever, but it actually does cost something, and that's part of the one of these issues. So you not only have to compare the cost of the capital goods, but you have to compare the cost of actual materials, raw materials. How much does rubber cost compared to metals, compared to textiles, compared to wood, compared to everything, compared to land. How much is land worth?
You have the problem with the mic again.
I don't know. I did not touch anything, so maybe I'm going to have to invest in a better mic for next time.
Yeah, maybe. Now we can't hear you.
You cannot hear me?
Now you're back.
Okay. So you have to be able to compare the value of the different means of productions, as well as compare the values of the consumer goods.
Can I try some pushback?
You have to have a free market in everything, which means that you have to have private property in everything, which means that you have to have private ownership of capital, the capital goods.
Okay, I want to push back on this point.
Yeah, go ahead.
For the sake of the argument I'm going to make, I'll accept all what you said. So now we can know that you can't have fully controlled economy. But how much control can you have there? Because, for example, in Finland, our flat tax is like something like 70% when you add up all the different taxations we are getting. So it's very, very high, and we have very, very much of this bureaucracy. So when does it become then really big problem, or how much should it be? What's the...
Right. Yeah. So of course that is a really good question, and that's the question that Ludwig von Mises at the time, and again he was writing in the 20s and 30s, and he lived later, but this was a question, of course, that was brought up. Says, okay, eventually most people, not everybody, but most economists did agree with his argument that it applied to pure socialism or pure communism, in the sense of that no means of productions be privately owned, that it's all owned by the government or by the proletariat or whatever. So the common property or common ownership of the means of production. Most economists at some point agreed with his argument that could not work. And of course, if you look at what the actual results in the real world, it basically proves his argument. I mean, every socialist economy where the means of productions were owned or are still, like if you look at North Korea today, it's a complete disaster, right? All the means of production are owned by the government, and they have no idea what they're doing. They're starving. Where their neighbor just to the south, South Korea, with the the same kind of people, presumably the same kind of cultural values, except for communism. They are very prosperous. There's no starvation. Everybody has plenty, and they're pretty happy. So that's a pretty powerful demonstration of the validity of the economic calculation argument. But you are absolutely right that when it comes to what would be called maybe a mixed economy, or a more like what sometimes these days when we say a socialist country, what we mean is the means of productions are still privately owned, but you have a really high degree of government intervention into the economy in the form of taxes or a pretty large welfare state, where you have a lot of help to the poor. You have a lot of subsidies, perhaps, to some industries. You have different incentives, and definitely taxation, of course, is and also regulation. This the rules that you impose on what people can do, and some of it is necessary. You should, for example, have regulation limiting or prohibiting certain forms of pollution, for example, because it would not be a good thing for a private factory to produce a bunch of goods, but then emit a bunch of pollutants in the atmosphere that everybody else has to breathe, and that nobody bears the cost for. So, there's definitely a need for some of these regulations, for sure. But of course, the argument that people like me would make is we've gone way, way, way too far in that direction. And we are regulating things like in the EU, I know that they have regulations even limiting the size, the minimum size for bananas, which is completely insane. I mean, it's the amount of regulation in the EU is beyond insanity. There is no justification for it. But anyway, except to keep the politicians employed doing things. I guess that's the justification. But to go back to your question, Ludwig von Mises' argument was, well, eventually, at some point, what's going to happen is these government interventions will cause more and more problems, and those problems will have to be solved with more government intervention, which will create even more problems. And then eventually, after a while, which what a while means, it could be decades, it could be a long time, it could be a couple of generations, but at some point, the economy is going to have to make a decision to either go back to the real free market or to go full socialist. And you can see in America today, some of the candidates for the next presidential election, like Bernie Sanders, are pretty much advocating for something that might not be full socialism, but they're getting closer and closer to it, which would tend to lend credence to this argument. They're pointing out to a bunch of problems which have been created by the fact that we already are too socialist in many ways. So the government has created all these problems, and the solution for some people is to have even more government intervention, when the obvious solution would be to cut back on government intervention. But, okay. So the argument that Ludwig von Mises would have made and did make was that eventually this is going to spiral in a way which comes to full socialism, and then we're going to have the economic calculation argument comes into full force. In the meantime, his argument was, even in the meantime, even though it does not prevent economic calculation completely, it does skews the economic calculation in a way that it's creating a bunch of malinvestment. In other words, it is creating incentives to invest in the wrong kinds of things. And we saw that with the financial crisis of 2008 was an excellent example of that. There were government incentives in the United States and other places that incentivized people to buy houses that they already could not afford. And so government intervention in the housing market created a boom in the housing market, which eventually came to crashing down and almost brought down the whole economy with it. And so that's a good example of how economic calculation, specifically in the housing market, was distorted by government intervention. People had no sense in what the real value of a house really was, because there was not a free market. I mean, on the books, it was a free market. In other words, people weren't forced at gunpoint to buy houses from the government or anything like this. But what happened is the incentives established by the government made it look as if houses were a much better investment than they really were. And at some point, people figured it out, and when they did, it all came crashing down. So anyway, back to you.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I want to ask about that crisis in markets, housing crisis, because there are kind of these informational bubbles easily that, for example, if you are in a left-wing group and you watch the news or whatever, then you see only certain side of the story. And if you're a right-wing place, you see only certain news topics and such, and it's really annoying because you would like to see the whole picture, but it's very hard because people are blocking each other and disconnecting the connection. It's actually hard for me to do this kind of show, because if I ever say something to leftists that they even kind of acknowledge that I know something is on or ask something about anything, then they'll just block you and you don't even see what they are up to or write about. And it's very annoying. But so there's this kind of a rumor that it was even more specifically like, was it that the United States were giving more lower price houses to black people?
Well, it wasn't exactly lower prices. What it was is what they were forcing the banks to give loans to people who would never have been able to qualify for the loan in the first place, normally. And basically the joke was, you didn't have to have any income, no savings, no nothing. You had, typically in the past, to get a loan to buy a house in the United States. I know in Europe it's somewhat different, but the principle is the same. You had to put something like 20% of the value of the home up front, cash. So you had to save. Let's say you have a $200,000 house. You would have had to have $40,000. Yeah, that's right. $40,000 in savings, to put, and then you would borrow the other $160,000 from the bank. They would give you a loan, but you had to have the 20%. Just before the housing crisis and the financial crash in 2008, you were able to get a 0% down loan. So they would lend you the whole $200,000. And in the past, they had standards like how much income you had to have. They would do a proportion of what your yearly income is compared to how much you wanted to borrow. And, they would also look at how much savings you might have or other assets, that you had that were worth something. And all that stuff stopped. And in large part, yes, it was due to government pressure on the banks to loan money to people who normally would not have been able to. And it's true that a good portion, not exclusively, but a good portion of these people were minorities, black people, that had very low income. But there was this perceived discrimination. They were saying, well, the banks are not loaning to black people because they are black. No, they were not loaning to them because black people did not have enough income. And you can discuss all you want, what the cause of that is. That's a different story. But the fact is, black people were not being discriminated against because they were black. They were discriminated against not as black, but as low-income families. They did not have the income stream to be able to repay the loans. Now, the theory was, well, the house prices keep going up and up and up and up. So the banks were like, well, okay, normally we would never lend this money to these people because they don't have the income to justify it. It's too risky. But what the theory was, well, two things. First of all, they were pretty much guaranteed that if the whole thing went down, they would be bailed out by the government. And this is exactly what happened, okay, in the end. So the banks were too big to fail. So instead of going bankrupt, the taxpayer had to give them the money to not go bankrupt. But the other thing is, the banks were counting on the fact that, well, let's say the people are not able to make the payments on the loan. It's not a big deal because by then the house itself will have appreciated as an asset and they will be able to sell it for more than what they paid for. And so they'll be able to repay the loan. They will have to sell the house, of course. They can't keep the house, but at least the bank would not lose any money, right? So that $200,000 house, like a year later, might be worth $230,000, sometimes more. And so they say, okay, well, they borrowed $200,000. They can't repay it because they lost their job. They can't pay. But no big deal. We're going to sell the house for $230,000. We take our $200,000, back plus interest, and the family can keep the rest. So where's the problem? There's no problem, except that, of course, the thing that happened is the housing started going down in value. And so now you had people with $200,000 in loan and their house was only worth $150,000. So they could not repay the loan. So the bank took the house back, and of course it precipitated all kinds. It was a cascade of events. It was very complex. So it's more complicated than just this, but this was a huge part of it. There was a lot of other factors involved, but this essentially was what precipitated the crisis. Is that you had a lot of loans that should never have been made, but because of government intervention, were in fact made, that were extremely risky, and should, in a free market, these loans would never have been made. Never. The risk was much too great.
This is so funny because you don't know kind of maybe the Finnish political culture, that I would need to give a trigger warning to my listeners that these are really hardcore right-wing economic free market.
It's reality. It's not right wing or left wing. It's just reality. I know.
Yeah.
People on the left have a hard time dealing with reality. That's all. That's a very difficult thing for them to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I feel your pain because when you deal with leftists in general, you have to stop thinking in terms of that they care about reality. They don't really care. It's not a big factor to them. Well, or I mean, to some extent, their reality that there's a bunch of billionaires and millionaires everywhere, and if we just took all their money, then everything would be fixed. So, again, that's their reality. It's very childish and naive, but I suppose that's the reality they live in.
And just when they are about to pass that law to get to that utopia, then all the capital just internationally flies away from your country and you are left with nothing.
Yeah, but even with the math, people have done this many times. You could tax the rich, like in the United States. You could take 100% of their wealth, like today, this year, and you would be able to pay for the budget for maybe a year or two, and then that's it. These people would of course be bankrupt now. They produce nothing. So the whole economy, you could make it run for maybe a couple of years, and then what? What do you do then? So the whole trick of Western government is to, of course, you basically suck the blood of the economy like a vampire, but just enough to keep the victim alive, right? You don't want to suck all the blood because then, of course, the corpse will die and there's nothing left for you to do and you will starve. So the trick is to figure out where the right point is, where you suck enough blood from the economy to keep it just alive, to keep the government going, but to try to get the maximum blood out of it without killing it, right? So that's why you have changes in government, because some governments overdo it, and then I have the best example I had. Well, of course, it's happened many times, and it's happened in Sweden, I think in the 70s and 80s, where the socialists went overboard. And the example I know the best personally is the example of France after François Mitterrand was elected president in 1981. And he started to implement hardcore socialist policies like nationalizing big industry, nationalizing banks, imposing price controls, high taxation, all these things, very socialistic. I mean, it was definitely not communist in a sense, there was still private property and things like that. It wasn't that bad. But within 2 years, they had to completely reverse course because it was a complete economic disaster. It was catastrophic. There was massive inflation. I remember I started living in Europe, in the UK in 1983, so this was at the tail end of this. But the dollar became very, very strong in exchange to a French franc. This was before the euro, came online. So because the French economy was in shambles. And so even the socialist François Mitterrand had to admit that he had gone too far the wrong way. And in some ways, after that, they ended up being more liberal, in the traditional sense of liberal, of letting the economy be run by free markets than it was before. So, so the same thing happened in Sweden. Same thing happens in many countries where the socialists the pure socialists come in power. They implement their policies. It's a disaster every time. There's no exception to this. There's no exception, not a single one that I can think of. And so, of course, then they have to backpedal and go back on what they said. So of course, then you end up with this sort of hybrid system where it's mostly based on market economics, but with a significant degree, and that degree varies significantly from country to country. But the degree of intervention by the government in the economy, and like I said, the intervention is in the form of taxation. And again, and there we have to distinguish between individual taxation and corporate taxation. So the regimes, like a lot of people think the US has low taxes, right? And in some ways it's true compared to a lot of European countries. But until President Trump changed the law on the corporate taxation a couple of years ago, we actually had in the US one of the highest rates of corporate taxes anywhere in the world. That some people don't understand that. But that was a huge economic disadvantage for us to compete at the international level, because our corporations were taxed much more than even corporations in Sweden. Now, of course, it's changed. The taxes have been lowered, and and it's good for the economy. But so there's taxation, then there's regulation, so imposing restraints on how things can be produced and how much. Then sometimes there are price controls, and price controls are not very prevalent in most Western countries except in one sector, and that's agriculture. So there's a lot of intervention by countries in the US and in Europe, but more in Europe, I would say, in agricultural production. A lot of subsidies, a lot of controls, a lot of destruction of products that are produced in excess because of the subsidies. A lot of distortion of the market. It's just incredible. But it's not the only thing. Then there are tariffs, import tariffs, which has to do with taxation in a way. Tariffs are just another form of taxation. And when you put all these things together, I think the latest statistics is in France, I know the government basically controls 56% of the economy if you go by what the government control the overall gross domestic product is. So anything above 50% obviously is, you could argue that's become, it is a socialist country in a way. And that proportion in Europe is typically pretty close to around 50% in most countries, sometimes less, sometimes more. But it's very typical for Europe. Now, so my contention would be that that's not sustainable, and that eventually, I think Ludwig von Mises' predictions will come to fruition. But the thing is, it may take a long time. I don't think in the case of Europe it's going to take that long, because of something I mentioned in our earlier discussion about demography, demographics, and the fact that Europeans are having no children, they're not even close to replacement rate, and that their entire economies and their welfare economies in particular are based on a pyramid where you have a lot of young workers paying for a few older retirees, and that the pyramid is going to become inverted. So you're going to have very, very few young workers who are going to have to bear the burden of paying for the retirement and the health care of lots and lots of old people. And that just cannot work. And immigration is not going to fix it. It's not fixing it. It's not going to fix it. It's a hopeless cause, unless there is one way out. Is to recognize Ludwig von Mises' argument and go back to a real free market economy. Then it will solve itself. But of course now, we are so used to this mixed economy that the transition period back to a free market economy will be very painful for a lot of people. But I really don't see any other solution in the long term. I think, of course, you would have to do it very gradually so you don't hurt people too much, but some people are going to get hurt no matter what. The traditional way that governments had tried to solve this problem without people feeling that they are hurt too much is through inflation. So by inflating the currency, basically what you do is you decrease the values of the pensions that people are receiving, because typically those are what's called fixed income. And so you are able to shift some of that burden that the elderly retirees are imposing on the country back on them, so to speak, through inflation. But of course, that's a two-edged sword. So that would get us into a very long discussion about the specific economic calculations there. But the fact is, mathematically, I don't see a solution to the current conundrum or dilemma that Europe, and to some extent the United States as well, has put themselves in. There is no easy way to get out of it. And we saw that in Greece. Greece was the extreme example of the logic of continuing along that path, right? So Greece did exactly the same thing that the rest of Europe did, except they did it faster. They voted themselves a bunch of benefits. Everybody able to retire at 55 years old or 60 years old with full benefits and free healthcare and free this and free that. And on top of that, they were having no children. The birth rate in Greece, I think, is like 1.1 or 1.2, which, for just to keep the population even, you need a 2.1 replacement rate. So it means 2.1 children per couple, per married couple. And they are having about half of that. So the population of Greece is going to decrease and decrease and decrease. And with more and more older people that are not working, and fewer young people who are working, but a lot of them are leaving Greece because there's no jobs for them. So they go to like Dubai or the US or Germany or other places where there are jobs. So young people don't tend to want to stay in Greece because there's no future for them there. So it is a completely catastrophic situation. And people don't understand that because, of course, as I said, hundreds of billions of euros have been poured into Greece to sort of mask the extent of the disaster there. But it's reality. At some point, reality will come back and show itself. You can only close your eyes so long. At some point, the bus will come at full speed and hit you in the face. And when it does, it's going to be bad.
I think it's gonna be really good, very a God's blessing to have this kind of writing economic politics on this Finland situation, because we are really headed for somewhere. We haven't have a socialist in head of our country right now. But so do you want to somehow wrap up the Misus's argument, or was it that? Because I think I can't push back right now more. I have to kind of digest it because this is all very new information for me.
Well, I would definitely read more on it. Now, the economic calculation argument is a very famous. Now, I understand it's not famous these days in current culture. People don't tend to bring it up. And the reason is because of something you pointed out. You know, it's considered something that applies mostly to a pure socialist regime or communist regime where the means of production is already owned entirely by the government. And we know that in our mixed economies, that is not the case. So people tend to forget about the argument. But to a large extent, it still does apply. The original argument was that you cannot calculate the value of things without free exchange. The new argument in mixed economies would be, well, it's not impossible to calculate, but the calculation itself now is really not correct because there's so much government intervention in various forms that the true value of both consumer products and production is actually miscalculated. So it's it is still you're still able to calculate it, but the accuracy of the calculation is not very good because of all these government interventions that are providing the wrong incentives one way or the other. And I said, I gave the example of the housing market in the US and other places. In fact, there was a big housing crisis in Japan and, 15 years before the 2008 crisis, something similar happened in Japan. And if you want to study a country that has it even worse as far as demographics and huge budget deficits and things like that than even Europe and the US has, it's Japan. Japan has a huge problem on their hand. The only reason they're able to survive so far is because they have 0% interest rates. But I don't know how long that can last. And by the way, having 0% interest rate basically makes it has the result of making the economic calculation incorrect. People think there is more capital available than there really is, and so people are willing to take more risk with capital, and at some point, that's not going to have good results. So we'll see. No.
But you can also look at Japan another way, because there is now this just came out a new video game. I don't know if you play PlayStation, but this Hideo Kojima's Death Stranding. It's this kind of an epic movie-like game, and like many these kind of public artists and comedians or whatever, he's come out for this masterpiece and say very leftist politics. He basically said that his game is about connections, building connection, and it's on the age of Trump and Brexit, and we need to build connections to connect to America and stuff like that. And then when you think about that, maybe we should build a really big ladder from the deepest, darkest places of Africa into Japan, because they are very ethnically homogeneous land.
All right.
And that could save them when the birth rate goes down, because if the birth rate somehow gets back up, then it's not all lost. But if you have a multicultural society, then I think it's almost impossible to come up from that.
Well, that's probably a valid argument. I think with Japan, it's difficult because their whole culture now. I mean, young people don't want to get married. They don't want to, like, they don't even want to date each other. Men, they just want to stay. They just want to play video games and amuse themselves to death. And the traditional, values of having a family and raising children and teaching them your own culture and things like that. It seems, I mean, I don't know. I haven't lived in Japan, so this is things that I read and hear, and I'm able to observe to some extent talking to Japanese people. But yeah, of course, like you said, it's always possible that the culture could change back, and then there would be a reaction, and that the people will. But you're right in the sense that even if you have a low birth rate, as long as your cultural values are intact, I think there is hope. So I would agree with that. I think it's more important to have the right cultural values than to have a lot of people.
Okay, last subject I want to bring up before we wind down is kind of this, what is happening in, I've been looking at Catholic bloggers, and they are talking about the Amazon synod. Have you heard about that?
No.
Okay, there's kind of this, they're doing some kind of cultural Christianity things in Amazon, and they are afraid, Catholics, that they are trying to bring kind of paganism into the Catholic religion. There was a famous account just some time ago where there was this Pachaka, this kind of idol, wrong gods in Catholic premises, and someone took them out and threw it into the river. And then, of course, the Pope thanked for when they were returned to the Christian church, where they never should be there. Like, don't make idols, kind of basic stuff, but
Right.
they have something going on there. And it's very interesting that I think that they are now talking about kind of these UN population control plans. They are really interesting.
Oh.
Like that, they're thinking that they want to cut down on people, but then
that's the whole climate change thing is about this. So if you want, but that would be a long discussion in and of itself. Maybe
that would be really interesting discussion.
That would be next time. But yeah, the UN,
yeah,
population control is, of course, it's a huge part of the the climate change narrative, and it's just beyond reprehensible. But the whole thing with Greta Thunberg, and it's unbelievable that people will go to this. Say the values of don't lie, cheat, and steal. Well, obviously, lying is no longer a value for these people because that's all they're doing. All they care about is their agenda, and any means necessary to further their agenda, they will pursue, no matter how unethical it is.
Yeah, and you can also see that they push the agenda so hard. Like, it's even another question: do you believe in climate change or not? And we can have that. But the more important question is that other thing that, well, what are they pushing towards societies with this climate agenda? They are just what you mentioned before: more tariffs, more taxation, all these things that leftist parties want anyways, was there climate catastrophe or not. So I find that particularly odd.
Yeah, no, it is. It's there's an undercurrent of anti-human philosophy in this whole thing, and that humans are they're like a plague on planet Earth, and the fewer humans they are, the better. I mean, I guess that theme was recently sort of explored in the Avengers movie. You've seen the last two. Avengers,
I have seen
Avengers Infinity Wars and Avengers Endgame. One of the themes is, well, the bad guy Thanos wants to get rid of half the population, and I don't know why half is the right number, but whatever. I think he was being generous, because I think some of these leftist activists, they don't want half the population, they want to cut it by like 99%. You know, they would like to see 90 or 99% of the population of the Earth being dead, so that they could have this pristine natural Earth, where they can catch a bunch of diseases, because there will be no medicine anymore and all that stuff, and they'll starve to death, of course. But at least the Earth will be pristine and clean without humans. So I guess that's good to them.
Yeah, that is very important. So, to wrap it up, do you have any projects, or maybe you want to shout out when you had that different YouTube channel discussion, if you want to promote that or whatever projects, and also add there your favorite, like what Mises books or arguments people should read to get really bottom of these questions we have had today, and then whatever you want to add.
Well, that could be a long list. But yeah, I would definitely recommend people read. Of course, it's not easy to read, but Ludwig von Mises' main opus, work is called Human Action, and it's a pretty thick book. You won't get through it in one night, that's for sure. But he does address economic calculation in there, among other things. And basically, he just derives an entire theory of economics based on the science of human action, which he termed praxeology. It's just a term from the Greek that means human, science of human action. But no, there's a lot more. You could read, the work by Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises. More recently, Thomas Sowell is one of my favorite authors on the right, and a very wise man. But again, there's a lot. But all I can say is, to everybody, educate yourself, and you should read both sides. I mean, I don't want to waste too much of my time now. I'm old enough that I know if I'm going to read some of these leftist things. I have read some in the past, because I think you have to be educated on both sides of the argument. And one of my basic principles is I would never argue against something unless I could make the opposite side's argument. All right, at least to some extent, at least at some basic level. I should be able to explain the other side. If you can't explain the other side's argument, then don't even start, because you don't understand the problem. So I try to understand the other side, but of course you can only go so far. At some point you say, okay, I've tried to understand your point, but I still find that it's wrong, or at least mistaken, or it needs some tweaking. And in some cases, I've come to the conclusion that some of the arguments on the other side are downright absurd. I mean, they don't even hold, they can't be consistent with their own arguments. So it's like if I were going to make an argument against reason, you would know I'm wrong, right? Because what I'm saying is, I'm going to argue, therefore I'm going to use reason to try to convince you that you shouldn't use reason. Does that make any sense? Why would I use reason to convince you that you shouldn't use reason? You're contradicting your own argument. And I found that on the left, a lot of their arguments fall into that category. They are completely contradicting themselves from the get-go. Like, even the mere fact of saying there are no absolute cultural value, I could ask them, well, is that an absolute value that you just said? There are no absolute cultural value. Is that an absolute cultural value or not? What is it? If it's relative, I don't have to listen to you, because I can still claim, say, well, I think I have absolute values and that's it. But if you say, well, that's an absolute value, but then, that's the only absolute value, then you would have to explain why that is. Either there are absolute cultural values or there are not. And if you hold that the only absolute cultural value is that there are no absolute cultural values, then you're going to have to explain that one to me from a logical point of view, because it doesn't make any sense. So anyway, I think a lot of the arguments on the left are that basically absurd. Not all of them. There are arguments on the left that are a lot more sophisticated. So I don't want to caricature the whole left as saying that they're all, obviously absurd. There are some good books and some good arguments. When I say good, it doesn't mean that they eventually cannot be discarded, but that you do have to take them seriously. You have to address them seriously. But there are some other arguments you don't have to take seriously. They're just absurd by their own standards. So anyway.
If I just want to give a couple of thoughts about just very quickly end there, that I think there is kind of like this naked power struggle in a lot of what leftists do and what they say, and it doesn't hold water in that way. I'm just thinking that how I see it is kind of that they have noticed that if you have any kind of society, it has some kind of hierarchy, and whatever that hierarchy is, there will be always people in the marginals. And by concentrating all of your energy on the people on the marginals and convincing them that this is unfair structure, and if it just were more fair, you could have the communist utopia, you could have better society, then you can get them to try to kind of concentrate huge energies to change society so that it would better address there. But the irony is that however you construct your society, it will still have people in the marginals. So you don't actually correct it, but what you do is kind of have this cultural struggle against values of Christianity and reproduction, heterosexual reproduction, and it's just insane. And thank you so much, and we'll maybe have another chat. And I thank you so much for these arguments, and be safe.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It was great, good, excellent discussion. I hope people get something out of it.
Definitely.